Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Greet your neighbors. Today's invocation will be given by Louise Keating.
Every leaf speaks bliss to me, fluttering from the autumn tree. That statement from Emily Bronte was on my mind as we are gathering here today to give thanks to our Creator. Humans are a lot like leaves, alike in many ways, but having differences in color and size, abilities and purpose. The beauty of fall is greater because of those differences in the leaves. As we thank the Creator for the beauty in the world that surrounds us, let us give thanks for our human differences and be encouraged to appreciate the joy those differences can bring to all the seasons of our life. Amen.
Thank you, Louise. Well, welcome everybody. Hope everybody had a great weekend. I know I didn't have enough trick-or-treaters at my house last night because I had leftover candy. So that's never a good thing if my house had leftover candy. And I guess with the end of Halloween, we can officially call it the Christmas season now. Of course, I guess if you're in retail, that probably started 3 or 4 weeks ago. Good weekend again. Football-wise, I always have to comment on football. I guess the Browns disappointed us a little bit yesterday. And although the Buckeyes won, I felt like it was a loss. We didn't win by the margin we were supposed to. So, but a shout out to the Wooster High School football team who had a very big upset, defeating Olentangy Berlin on Friday night. So they live to see another game this Friday. So congrats to the team. Also, I know I saw many of you last week at the Wayne Economic Forum. That's a great event that the Chamber puts on and he has helped organize for many years. Lots of great speakers. I know I've already taken some of the advice and started to password protect some of them, doing the dual authentication. So great event last week. Just want to mention, I know Tom Rumbaugh is going to be talking about flags here in a second, but that we do have our last flag holiday coming up. The flags will be placed this weekend, the 6th and the 7th, and we have needs for troubleshooters, and that activity will occur probably mostly on Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. And so what is troubleshooting? Basically, it's pretty easy to do. So we have calls that come in either from groups that are putting up the flags that couldn't find the pipe, or maybe a homeowner who was missed, and we just send somebody out to that address. So you get a supply of flags, go out to the address, and probably 80% of the time you can find the pipe. It's just sometimes they're going by it quickly. So put the pipe up and move on to the next one. So the more people we get to help with that, the fewer addresses that each person needs to do. So please let me know. I know I sent an email out to several individuals, but please confirm with me if you're going to be available for that this holiday. Last thing I have before I turn it over to Lynn is our Today in History. So November 1st, 1982, the first Asian automobile company to produce cars in the United States was Honda, starting with the Accord in Marysville, Ohio. So it's still going strong down in Marysville, I know. So I thought that was an interesting fact for today. All right, now I'm going to turn it over to Lynn with the Secretary's report.
Thank you, President Terry, and we'll start with visiting Rotarian and her husband. Julia Weinstein is the past president of Warren Rotary Club and also a current assistant district governor, and her husband Mark are here with us. Can you stand up? Thank you. I should add, they're friends of our speaker, Dr. Michel, so thank you for bringing them along. Appreciate it. Past President Bobby Douglas has the traveling microphone. We'll start with past President Kathy McConnell.
My guest today is the spouse of our speaker, Michel. She also is out at OARTC, but even more importantly, she is a founding member of the Jam Club, Birthday Salute Club, along with me for long.
Sarah Bacon.
Hi, today I have Gage Ryder with me. Gage is a litigator at Critchfield. He just started this fall, so we're happy to have him.
And Steve Webster.
On behalf of Greg Long and myself, I'd like to welcome our guest, Jody Starcher.
Thank you. We have two announcements from the podium, Tom Rumbaugh and Becky Foster. And while they're coming forward, I'd just like to welcome back. Hopefully she can hear us. And you saw Sarah Lucy is back with us. So it's great to have her come back. And also on Zoom, we should have Judy Wood back with us. So we're glad Judy's got a clean bill of health, and her husband is also home and recovering well. So thank you for supporting both Sarah and Judy.
Hello, I am part of the Al Van Wee basketball tournament and food drive committee. And the food drive is going on this week, and we have food being collected at Wooster Township School. Unfortunately, Shreve's not participating this year, so we're a little concerned about the amount of food we have, but it's being dropped off at the school by the parents at the pavilion at every morning. So today, Joe, maybe you could report even where did you get a lot of food there today? Joe went and picked it up, or you don't know? I didn't pick it up. Okay, that's okay. Well, our president, Terry, sent out a sheet last week, a sign-up sheet on Friday with his weekly newsletter. We need some help this week. Justin Starling has agreed to go out there every day at 9:30 to get whatever food is there daily and bring it back here. And then the sign-up sheet, we need some people here like about 10 a.m. to help unload the food. And also the sign-up is for the Al Van Wee tournament and collecting food there and doing 50-50 there and other jobs. So that is November 19th and 20th. So we need some people. Please check your email and do Sign Up Genius because we need some help. Anything else?
Hello, seems like it was only yesterday I was badgering you for volunteer help. But as you know, the flag season is ending, and as Terry pointed out, we need a lot of volunteer help for troubleshooting. I'm in charge of the flag maintenance, and our next job will be is at the tail end of taking the flags down. On Friday, November 12th, from 3 to 6, we work out at the flag maintenance building, helping the groups collect the flags and bring them back into the storage building where they can be assessed. And that's Friday, November 12th from 3 to 6, and Saturday, November 13th, 9 to noon. And then, as you know, until we go back out in May, we take that time during the winter to assess each flag, make sure they're in a good order, replace the ripped flags and get ready for the next season. So if you can't make it this time, you'll be seeing plenty more of me to get the flags ready for next season. Thank you.
Thank you, Becky and Tom. Alvan Wheat Tournament, as you all know, last year we didn't have it. This year, sort of still, like I say, we're coming off COVID and there's still a lot of hesitancy, as Becky indicated. Not all of our schools that had participated in the past are participating again this year, but we're hoping that we'll get back on track here and look forward to a full event next year. Welcome to all of our guests. It's great to see so many of you here today with us. Appreciate you being here and hope you enjoy the program. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dee Vidia to introduce our speaker today.
Dr. Frederick Michel, Jr. got his BA in biochemistry from the University of Colorado in Boulder, and his BS in chemical engineering also from the University of Colorado in Boulder. He then went to Michigan State University, where he received both his Master of Science in Chemical Engineering and his PhD in Chemical Engineering. In the Department of Food, Agriculture, and Biological Engineering, or FADE, as it's called, at OSU, at the OSU College of Food, Agriculture, and Environmental Sciences, Dr. Michel's group conducts research in 3 areas. 1, composting, focused on the recycling of food scraps, yard trimmings, and manure, understanding and mitigating the impacts of contaminants such as herbicides, plastics, and pathogens, and understanding the effects of compost on the microbial ecology of soils and plant growing media. 2, pre-treatments to improve bioethanol production from corn and cellulosic feedstocks and biogas production during anaerobic digestion. And 3, bioprocessing for the extraction and purification of natural rubber and inulin, which is a word I didn't know till 2 days ago, which is a naturally occurring polysaccharide from the roots of the Russian dandelion. He serves as the editor of the Compost Science and Utilization Journal, is a board member of the Organics Recycling Association of Ohio, serves as the U.S. Composting Council's Persistent Herbicide Task Force, is the president of the Wayne County Sustainable Energy Network, and is the chair of the OSU Wooster Sustainability Committee. He teaches the Ohio Compost Operator Education course, Solar Energy Systems, and Food, Agriculture, and Biological Engineering courses related to biomass conversion. He has published more than 70 peer-reviewed scientific papers, and in 2011 received the Rufus Cheney Award for Research Excellence from the U.S. Composting Council. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Dr. Fred Michel.
Thank you very much. I sent Dee 3 sentences, so he did some research there. But it's good to be here and to see many familiar faces. I'm going to talk today about composting for organics recycling. Some of the work that I was really hired to do here when I moved in 1999 was really to look at the composting process and how it could be used to address solid waste management. Okay, so next slide. You'll have to advance it. It's not there. We go. Okay. Okay, so I'll start with an introduction and just talk in general about organic waste in the U.S. and then describe the composting process and some systems that are used across the country for composting, and then talk a little bit about food scrap composting, a little bit on local projects that we've been developing, and then some of the research we've been doing at ORDC, and then take some questions. So if you look at the sources of organic waste in the United States, it really comes from three sources. There's manure, and I just wanted to show you the magnitude of these. There's about 355 million tons per year of manure generated. Most of this is then land applied after being stored. You'll see some storage systems around the state where these are stored in lagoons. They're land applied in the spring or sometimes in the fall before crop production, but they can't be applied year round. And then you have crop residues, which would be things like straw or corn stover. Some of these are collected, but most of them are just returned to the soil. And then we have municipal solid waste. And that includes things like yard trimmings, food waste, biosolids, which come from wastewater treatment plants. And most of these particular materials are sent to landfills. And there's two problems with sending them to landfill. One is that they break down and form methane, which is a greenhouse gas about 20 to 30 times more powerful than CO2. So if we can convert it to CO2, we can reduce those greenhouse gases that would otherwise be produced in the landfill. The second is that we spend a lot of energy to produce the fertility sources used to grow food and other things. So we take nitrogen out of the atmosphere using natural gas. We mine phosphorus all over, in Africa and in Florida. We obtain potassium from different sources by mining. And when we take that waste, which has high levels of these materials, and stick them in a landfill, those are lost. And we have to go through the whole process of generating them again. So by recycling those materials, we can use less energy and less resources to produce food and other things that we otherwise would use. So if we look at where we are today, but this is a few years ago, these data from the US EPA, but about 250 million tons per year of US municipal solid waste are generated. And if you look at the different fractions of these, a large fraction of this material could potentially be composted. If you look at yard trimmings, it's just leaves and grass, food waste, paper and paperboard, a lot of that's recycled, and some other materials, wood. But if you look at what we actually recycle currently, it's about 87 million tons of that. So most of our materials end up in landfills. And if you look particularly at the food waste fraction, almost no food waste is composted or recycled. So there's some great potential there. So what is composting? It's an aerobic process, uses oxygen, which uses microorganisms to decompose mixtures of organic matter to yield CO2, water, and humus, or compost. And that compost contains most of those nutrients that were in the food initially. It usually starts with a mixture of complementary materials. So things like wet, rich materials like food waste with like leaves or wood shavings and other things to give it the optimum conditions for organic matter decomposition. And usually at large scale systems, we talk about a thermophilic process, which means it happens at higher than ambient temperatures, usually 55 to 65 degrees centigrade or 140 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. And these high temperatures kill pathogens, for example, that may be present in manure. They destroy weed seeds that you may have collected in your yard, and they further accelerate this decomposition process. And the end product is compost, which is a topsoil-like product that allows these nutrients to be recycled. So how many backyard composters do we have here? Okay, so a lot of people do backyard composting, but a lot of the composting is done at much larger commercial scale systems. In fact, in Ohio, we have one facility. It's now not operating any longer, but it's in Medina, which collects all of your waste in one bag, and they separate it out into recyclables, compostable materials, and landfill materials. We also have, I said 23, but there's more than that now, but food waste composting facilities. These take food waste from residential facilities and industries. Most counties have class 3 or 4 facilities which handle yard trimmings. For example, we have a couple here in our county, which are not allowed to be put into landfills if they're collected separately. And then we also have 4 that I know of, and maybe one more, biosolids composting facilities operating at wastewater treatment plants. A survey we did a few years ago indicated that almost 10% of dairy farms also compost their manure for reapplication. And if you assume that, let me see if you can see that bottom part there. Let me see, how can I get rid of that? But anyway, it says basically that if we assume that, say, 5% of people, households compost their food waste and yard trimmings in their backyard, there's also another significant number of people who do that as a way to manage solid waste. So composting, you may not have heard about it, but it does really have a big impact on solid waste management in the state. This shows the different facilities that are presently registered with IOEPA in the state, and they range in size from small, 1,000 yards per year, up to very large, 100,000 yards per year facilities, closer to urban areas. So unlike what you do in your backyard, which usually have a bin, most composting is done in things called windrows. And these are about 14 to 20 feet wide, anywhere from 4 to 10 feet high. And they're put in long rows so they can be easily mixed and turned. And one of the interesting properties of these, this is a photo I took with a regular camera and then with an IR camera, which shows the temperatures within these right after we turn them. So you can see in the center of the windrow, this is an area we haven't turned yet, it's very hot, 160 degrees Fahrenheit. And those temperature gradients go out to ambient on the outside. The way that oxygen moves through these piles is through passive convection. The air, that heat causes the air to rise and it brings in new oxygen from the side. So this mix, the turning we do isn't really to aerate it, it's just to mix the materials so they all are exposed to this high temperature. And then if you cut into one of these windrows, what you see is gradients of activity. And that's because we have, dry conditions at the top, wet conditions in the middle. We have ambient oxygen on the surface. We have very low oxygen concentration in the middle of the pile. And then we have oxygen, which is high in this outside of the pile and lower in the middle of the pile. So in this particular photo, you can see a little layer of white, which is a very active microbial layer where conditions are optimal. In the center is a darker color, where there's probably less oxygen there and maybe a wetter condition. But all these different conditions facilitate that organic matter decomposition and conversion. So this shows the temperatures within one of these piles at the center. And you can see that the process itself in these windrows takes about 100 days, so 2 or 3 months. So it's not something you do just in a week. It takes a long time of storage. And then once it's completed, those temperatures go back to ambient conditions as the material becomes stabilized and less active. So some of the benefits that we see are that we can destroy pathogenic bacteria that may be present in like wastewater treatment plant solids or manure. It stabilizes the organic matter and it creates it's a low odor process relative to something like anaerobic digestion where you have to contain the material because of the odor problems. You have a tremendous mass loss, both due to water loss and for the conversion to carbon dioxide. So you can have up to 50% just dry matter loss, and most of the water is lost as well. And then you have concentration of the plant nutrients that are there. So as that CO2 is lost, the remaining material retains those nutrients and it becomes more concentrated. And that's an advantage because when you think about something like manure, it's just a liquid, basically, that you have to drive around in a truck somewhere and put onto a field. Whereas this has been dried and it has more concentrated nutrients and a lot of the solid material has been converted to CO2. So you can drive it further and apply it less expensively. It also has carbon dioxide production rather than methane emission, which you have from anaerobic digestion in landfills. There's diverse microbial communities present in the compost, and these facilitate disease suppression when they're added to soils or in potting media. Maybe some of you may know Harry Hoyting, but he devoted his whole career to this aspect of disease suppression by compost. It increases the soil organic matter and allows us to sequester carbon in soils, so raise the organic matter of soils. And we've been doing a lot of work looking at it as a peat replacement. Peat is a non-renewable resource. There's tons of it in Canada, but in places like in the United States and Europe, it's been depleted largely. So we import a lot of that. And peat and compost has some benefits over peat. So it could be used to displace some of that in container media. So just a quick look at some different systems. So this is a backyard system. We do food waste composting in our backyards. We have a little bin like that one at the top. We put next to the sink and we collect things that are, when we think of food waste, they say, why don't you just clean your plate? that would solve the problem. Well, there's a lot of things that we're talking about aren't things you eat, like a banana peel, an apple core, a corn husk, maybe food that's gone bad can all be put and mixed in those systems. So at the smallest scale, we have urban systems that are just basically piles of material. And usually these are yard trimmings. And they may just be put into a pile, labeled with the year and gone back to after a year, turned one time, turned to 2 years later and sold. So those are the minimal kind of systems. And they just use the front end loader to turn those. But many municipal areas have combined yard trimmings, composting facilities that look something like this. There are multiple acres. They have all the leaves and brush that's collected in that municipal area, and it's processed using more sophisticated equipment. And this shows a facility that's on a small footprint, which you often see around urban areas like Columbus, where they don't have much land. They're trying to compost as much stuff as they can. And so they put them in these gigantic slabs like this. And then farm scale windrow composting is done with these windrow turners, which attach to a tractor like this. This is at OARDC. And this is our dairy manure, which all of it is composted there. And this is a swine manure facility. It's in the west part of the state. Now, one of the issues with these facilities is that they're outdoors and there's difficulty managing water, as you can imagine. And so more sophisticated systems are developed like this, where you have no rainfall on top of the compost material. And because you have these trenches, you can put a lot of material in there relative to a windrow. And so all of the water that lands on these is diverted as stormwater, and it can just run off the site or be collected, versus anything that touches the compost is termed leachate by the Ohio PA. It has to be treated. So it has to be collected separately, and it's a lot of effort and work to do that. So these have some advantages, even though they may be a little more expensive to build from the beginning. This is a system used in Toronto, which is a permeable Gore-Tex cover, like your jacket. And in Toronto, they're required to recycle all food scraps from the entire municipal area. So what they do is they put the food scraps in there, they mix it with some leaves, and they cover it with this fabric, which allows water vapor to penetrate, but doesn't allow snow or rainfall to land on it. And they aerate it from within the pile. This shows in Washington State, where they divert about 50% of their organic wastes to composting. One of the interesting things about this site is it's so clear, near to the Columbia River, but you can see they do manage their water by diverting into these streams. And it's a similar system to the one I just showed. This is in Mentor, where they have a biosolids composting facility. Mentor is very close to the lake, and so they are very careful about managing organics and biosolids there. And this shows the Akron wastewater treatment plant, which now is converted to anaerobic digestion, but they still do some composting of the material coming out of the digesters. This is another farm system which composts a mixture of dairy manure and horse manure. This is in Michigan. But the interesting thing about this trench system is you put material in one end, and that turner you see there in the middle moves it about 10 feet back. So it moves back, it gets about 10 to 15 turns and comes out the back end as finished material. And that turner can be moved to those different trenches along the way. This is a system which is used at the Richland Correctional Institute, where they compost all of the food waste that the offenders generate in the cafeteria. And so they compost it for about a week in this system, and then they move on to a windrow system later, and then they use the finished compost in the gardens there. And this shows a similar system at the Akron Zoo, which was just installed about a couple of years ago, but it's kind of interesting if you get a chance to see that. So they compost all of the manure from the zoo there. So a little bit about food scrap composting. 30% of food waste is wasted across the supply chain, and it contributes about 8% of total greenhouse gas emissions. Reducing this food waste could reduce CO2 emissions by 70 gigatons over 30 years. And it could also reduce greenhouse gas from landfills by converting it to CO2 rather than methane. Now, food scrap compost, as I said, has a high plant nutrient content of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and others, which is suitable for use as an organic fertility source. And recycling through composting further reduces the greenhouse gas emissions because we're not regenerating these nutrients, we're recycling them. So I'll show you some examples of food scrap composting facility. This is the Herzl Organic Composting Facility, which is near Toledo. And they do curbside compostable waste, animal waste, municipal yard trimmings, and commercial food waste. This just shows a sort of a Google shot of the whole facility. And the red color you see in those windrows is due to tomatoes, tomato skins, which is what they grow quite a bit of out there. And they have one of these Austrian windrow turners, very sophisticated turner, which they have grants available from the solid waste district there to help purchase this type of equipment. This is at Ohio University, and I go to Ohio State, so why am I showing Ohio University? Well, they actually compost all of their residential dorm food scraps, and we've yet to get to that point at Ohio State. But it has a system like this. If you can see in the bottom of this picture, there's just some regular bins like we have for collecting trash here. They put those at all the residence halls in the food scrap composting area, and then they convey them to the top and dump them out into this green bin there. And this part's the indoor part. And then here's the outdoor part. You can see the other part of that green bin where the material is mixed and aerated. And that's just for about a week or two in that system. And then it goes into these windrows where it's finished off. But the first part is just to keep the odors down and keep insects and other things from getting into the food scraps. And another interesting part of this facility is it's completely solar powered. Paradise Composting has been composting in our community for a while. They've been doing yard trimmings for a while, and they started doing food waste in 2008 and got a license for that. They've composted food scraps from College of Wooster, from Bueller's, Smucker's, Frito-Lay, and Walmart. And this shows a composting compactor, which used to be installed at the Bueller's store in town, where they would collect all of the bakery waste, produce waste, all that kind of thing. And they would then take it out to Paradise for food scrap composting. So this shows Paradise. It's out by Vulture's Knob, the mountain biking area there on Mechanicsburg Road. And these top windrows are all yard trimmings. And the bottom three there are yard trimmings that have been mixed with food scraps for composting. So this is a project I've been working on in Mansfield. It's an urban food scrap composting project. And the idea is that these food micro farms, which we've been setting up in areas where homes have been leveled by the feds, basically. So they have vacant lots. And then this is actually a brown field in the center of Mansfield. So we've set up a project where we build high tunnels for food production. And the fertility sources we're using are food scraps that have been composted from the local community. And what we've discovered, this is that site I was showing, which has 6 high tunnels on it, the NECIC urban farm. If just 30% of the people in this square participate in the food scrap composting program, we'll have generated enough fertility for these 6 high tunnels to produce tomatoes, other things for their farmers market. So it's kind of a local approach to waste management, but it eliminates the whole thing of collecting the stuff, driving it somewhere else, processing it somewhere else, bringing it back and using it. So the idea is to reduce the carbon footprint of solid waste management. And then this is a local system that just popped up in the last few years called the Wooster Bike Crew Composting. It's about 16 to 20 families participate. You get a 5-gallon bucket, costs $5 every time you swap the bucket out. And the finished compost is used in Molnar Park, which is across from the country club up here, and also sold. So this is the type of bucket you get here on the left. It's just a 5-gallon bucket. And then it's collected by a bicycle. So they ride the bike around and collect them. And then there's a small composting facility there. Now, these are allowed by the Ohio EPA if they're smaller than 500 square feet. So that's why he's allowed to do this at Molnar Park. The guy here you see standing there looking at it is a guy who developed Rust Belt Riders composting in Cleveland, which is now expanded to compost a lot of the organic scraps at restaurants, stores, and other places in Cleveland. So I have about 5 more minutes. I'm going to talk about some of our research we've done recently in the last few years. One is compostability of packaging materials. Another is persistence of pesticides in composts, microbial communities in compost, and process engineering of composting processes. So for a lot of these studies, we use a compost reactor system. We have 2 of these at OUDC, which we use, where we can simulate the conditions in the windrows. And then we can do things like collect all the gases coming off. We can take samples frequently, and we can do different experiments on like different temperatures, different moisture contents, different feedstocks, and make scientifically valid comparisons between treatments with this system. So in one study, we looked at some commercially available packaging materials which claim to be compostable or biodegradable. And we looked at them under 3 conditions: composting, anaerobic digestion, and just incubating in soil. And the soil incubation conditions we did for 2 years for these materials. And here's what we found with some of them. So their positive control is usually paper, so newspaper essentially, which is just made out of cellulose, breaks down very quickly. And then we found a couple of the materials do break down over time. This is 120 days. But a couple of them where they were claimed to be additives that you add to conventional plastics did not break down at all during the whole period, not significantly different than the non-amended materials. So another big area we're working on is the persistence of pesticides in composts. And I don't know if any of you noticed this, but up on Oak Hill Road in 2011, there was a bunch of dead trees along that road. And that was caused by one of these persistent herbicides called Imprellis, which was applied. So we did a recently collected compost from all over the United States. We collected 70 different ones. And we found that 4 of them exhibited symptoms of persistent herbicides. And they were from all over the place. And what they caused, if you look at this slide here on the right, you'll see that even at very low concentrations of about 10 parts per billion, they can affect plant growth. This is a bean plant, a bunch of green bean plants. And these are the symptoms you see. The center shows a plant that hasn't been affected, which is using compost, which isn't contaminated. The right shows one of these composts that we collected, that the plants completely lose apical dominance, which means they stop making new leaves. You can see on the right. And then the ones on the left have another symptom, which is called leaf curling and leaf malformation. So this slide that shows, let's see, you can't really see the bottom there, but let me see if I can move this thing here. Oh, no, okay, well, what this shows is samples of materials taken from a composting facility in the Midwest, where they took the time to measure the concentrations of all the different herbicides you could get at your store in the different materials. The green shows the feedstocks. The red shows in the hot compost windrows, and the blue shows the concentration in the finished compost. So what you see is that you see what you'd expect to see. You see 2,4-D, which is in wheat begone. You see glyphosate, and you see a bunch of other herbicides that are applied to lawns as they're collected. And you see those also in the active compost windrows. But you don't see them in the finished compost, except for 2 of them. And those 2 that we see, we call persistent herbicides. And those are the same ones we have been looking at before. But one is called clopyralid, and the other one here is called quinquirac. And you can see that they persist in the finished compost and not much lower concentrations than they were present in the feedstocks. So some of our work has been done to look at how these break down during composting, how can we accelerate their decomposition, and are there any materials we can add to the compost to mitigate this problem? This just shows that typically we find horse manure is often one of the feedstock ingredients that causes this issue. Okay, and finally, I'll talk about characterization of microbial communities. When we look at these compost communities, we don't just culture them on a plate. We actually extract all the DNA from the samples, and we amplify a gene called the 16S ribosomal DNA gene, which is present in every life form. And then we can compare the sequences to see how many different types of bacteria we have present in the sample. So these composts are incredibly diverse. We find from about 7,600 different operational taxonomic units or types of bacteria in 10 composts we examined from that survey. And 250 different fungal species identified. So there's many different organisms present that are doing this process. Interestingly, we found no pathogenal sequences, so no E. coli, Salmonella, Listeria, Campylobacter, the ones that we look for and are concerned about in these finished composts. So they had destroyed these groups of organisms. We also found many sequences of beneficial organisms like Trichoderma and Actinobacteria in all the samples. And just shows the classes of bacteria we find in those composts. We can look at the diversity of the sample, and we discover that about 150 species constitute about 90% of the compost community. So it was about 150 big actors there in that community. Now, this is important more and more because a lot of ornamentals, but increasingly food crops are produced in potting media like this. And the ingredients in that potting media are peat, usually pine bark, and then compost are also used. So what dictates the compost, the community in those feed mixes, or those potting media, is primarily the compost, not the peat or the pine bark. And you can see that in this slide. You can't see the bottom, but it shows that the communities within these different mixtures in the container media resemble those in the compost that's initially used and not in the peat or the pine bark. So just some plans, ideas for Wooster is to increase organic collection from the restaurants downtown. About 50%, more than 50% of the weight of in their dumpster is food waste. And that really should be good at composting. Engage with Bueller's and all other large generators in organics recycling, like at the composter we had at the north end. Expand some options for community organics collection. One idea is to have sort of a food scrap compost drop off at the farmer's market this summer, similar to that 5-gallon bucket system. Developing a food scrap composting program for Sisler Conference Center and ATI or ABC food services, which we have more of now. Expand the College of Wooster Organics Recycling, and work with the city and solid waste district to solicit proposals for 3-bin solid waste collection system for residents. These are systems that are used widely around the United States, and I think maybe time for Wooster. And here's a system we just saw. We were traveling in Connecticut, and everybody had one of these little green buckets. You just stuck at the end of their driveway with their food scraps to be collected. So just some acknowledgements of my students and sponsors for some of my research. And I'll take any questions.
I'll ask a question. So you made a great case on the benefits of commercial composting, mitigating greenhouse gases, capturing those nutrients that will help us grow in agriculture. Basically extending the life of landfills because we're not putting this good organic material, so we don't have to build new landfills. So what do you see are the biggest obstacles for communities like Wooster or even a little bit larger communities in understanding these benefits and investing in commercial composting?
I think it's just understanding that this is a possible option, and then working to develop systems that work. People think, oh, it's going to be this horrible, smelly mess, right? Well, actually, that stuff's already in the dumpster, right? It's going in the dumpster, and it's already a horrible, smelly mess. So separating it actually makes the problem a little easier to deal with. You know, you can collect that material separately, and then the other ones have material that's not going to be as bad for those issues. Another issue when we worked with restaurants has been space. So they have space for like one thing, and they really need a space for 2 or 3 for recycling and composting. So that's a challenge. Another issue we've seen is transportation. So somebody like Bart here at Paradise Composting, which is a class 2 composting facility, he loves to take food scraps and compost them, but how do you get them there? And a restaurant doesn't want to drive them up there unless you're like Local Roots does actually drive their stuff somewhere and compost it, but most places don't want to deal with that. So there's that disconnect between here and there, even though he's only 2 or 3 miles away. And so that's a real challenge, is getting the haulers. Most of the haulers are associated with landfills. and less so even with recycling. They do recycling just so they can do landfilling. And so they're not interested or able really to accept materials for composting. So it requires sort of a separate strategy to deal with the food scraps and that kind of thing. So I guess that's another challenge is having a site that's licensed. There's EPA rules for siting these facilities. We do have one licensed here nearby town, which is nice to have.
What can you tell us about communities that have community food composting and how they educate their residents to put appropriate things in the compost bins and not contaminate them with, the trash or inappropriate matter?
Yeah, so they have a combination of educational programs and signs saying what you can accept. And they also have programs do things where some communities just will not accept a bin that has a bunch of plastic and glass and junk in it that won't either be recycled, isn't recyclable, or isn't compostable. So they'll reject streams. Other places will put little stickers on it. They'll say, sorry, we can't take this because it is contaminated. Now, there is still, contamination is inevitable at these facilities. You'll always find little bits of plastic and that kind of thing in the material they receive. And there are ways of removing that with screening and other things at the end. And most of these facilities, if not all, have a process where they take the finished dry compost material and they go through a screening process to remove those last bits of materials. But they really can't sell. It's very difficult for them to sell anything that has any kind of contamination, in it at all. So they have to be, they're able to do it though in many places to get it, but it's always a big issue.
Dr. Michel, could you go back to herbicides and how those transmit from crops into, or how they're retained through the compost?
Okay, so herbicides have different degrees of biodegradability. So something like 2,4-D, which is in your weed begon, which a lot of people use to control broadleaf weeds in their lawn, and is also used in agricultural production. That material breaks down fairly quickly in the soil. It's not recoverable after a short period of time, and in compost as well. Glyphosate sticks very tightly. That's what's in Roundup. A lot of people use Roundup and they use it for all these Roundup ready crops. That sticks very tightly to inorganic matter in the soil, to minerals. So even though it's not that degradable, but is fairly degradable, not that degradable, it sticks to the soil very tightly and can't be released. So it's out of the system essentially. These other compounds are designed to be green herbicides. That's what they're touted as. And the reason they're said to be green is they're more potent. So instead of putting 55 gallons on your 10 acres, you're putting on 1 gallon. They're less degradable. And that way, instead of applying 2 or 3 times, you're applying once. And then because they are more potent, they require less transportation. So in some ways, they are greener, but because they're more potent and less degradable, they don't break down during a normal composting period, which would be like, say, anywhere from 2 to 8 months. The average is 8 months. So it's anywhere from 1.5 years to maybe 3 months of composting. But during that period, it's not long enough for those compounds to break down completely.
So, Dr. Michel, appreciate you taking the time to come here today and talk to us about composting. In recognition of your visit, we have this rendition of our Rotary Club wheel, Service Above Self, with the 4-way test on the back. And these are made locally by the Village Network. So thank you.
Thanks a lot.
I'm sure if anybody has any questions afterwards, Dr. Michel, would you be willing to stay a couple of minutes, come up and ask those questions? Just a couple of reminders. Next week, we will have our Veterans Day Armed Forces recognition and speaker Paula Ann Roderick. So you're encouraged to bring veterans to that program. If you do have guests, you can get a hold of Frank Relly. He can get them registered ahead of time so you can save a little time coming in next week and can get their names ahead of time in their name tag. So we'll look forward to that program next week, and also those service opportunities this week for the flag program and the Alvan We food collection would be appreciated for those of you who can step up to help with those. So thank you. Have a good week, Rotarians. We stand adjourned.